In Gallup, New Mexico, I'm Rosalinda Roman, and this is New Mexicast. Welcome back, everyone.
And years bring change. People grow, and memories remain. Memories remain.
Las Vegas, Nevada.
Memories remain. Yes, they do.
Hello and welcome to New Mexicast, my longtime video podcast or web series, which is now this enchanting weekly TV show. This episode is really a continuation of last week's episode, which contained parts 1 and 2 of my 4-part series on Holocaust survivor Gabrielle Falk and her family. Now on to parts 3 and 4. Now, even though this series was shot more than 5 years ago, and the story itself takes place in Germany, Switzerland, and France more than 50 years ago, the story and the message it carries is still very much relevant today. Welcome back to New Mexicast, everyone. It is a very cold and gray day here in Gallup, which is appropriate for the story that you're about to see. It is part 3 of a 4-part series on a Holocaust survivor and her family. If you haven't seen the first 2 parts, definitely go back and take a look at those. Part 1 is about her son, Stephen Falk, and his quest to pull together the scattered pieces of their family history. Part 2 is about Gabrielle in her early years before the war. And now on to part 3, which is about Gabrielle and her parents during the war, including the night that synagogues and Jewish businesses were burned and Jewish storefronts were shattered. It is infamously known as the Night of the Broken Glass, or Kristallnacht, and for Gabrielle's family, as for so many German Jews during that time, it really was a dark period in their history. This high-quality New Mexicast story is brought to you by... Where are we going?
What's the name of the dentist?
Is it Dr. Riachi?
Yeah.
For as long as my children have had teeth, and in fact long before my children ever existed, Dr. Gabrielle Riachi has been our family dentist.
Yep, we're gonna look in your mouth. You wanna do that? Well, have a seat with your
And once you visit Dr. Riachi and her exceptional team at ABQ Dentists, you will understand why.
Ready? Open big.
From the amazing way she puts nervous little ones and even nervous adults at ease,
Oh my God.
to the state-of-the-art dental equipment and expertise, ABQ Dentists is where you will find the smile you've always dreamed of. See for yourself at abqdentist.com.
Hello?
At 85 years old, Gabrielle Falk's hearing may not be what it used to be.
This is Gabrielle. This is all very recent, so now I have to remember before I answer the phone to push this to get the right.
But her mind and memories are sharp as tacks. And as a Holocaust survivor, she certainly has a lot to remember.
I think it was before the war broke out. Any non-Aryan person who was abroad at that point lost their German citizenship.
Which is why Gabrielle's sons, Stephen, Don, and Ray, encouraged her to record some of her memories for future generations.
My father was twice my mother's age when they got engaged. It was his second marriage and her first.
Among her earliest recollections, how the war affected her parents, Walther and Ellinor Freund. In 1936, anticipating trouble in their native Germany, the couple sent Gabrielle and her brother Andreas away to school in Switzerland. Gabrielle still remembers how the tone of their communication changed once the war began.
My parents continued to write, and they used some code language. At one point they said, Mr. Braun is no longer with us. Herr Braun ist nicht mehr bei uns. And it took me forever to remember that they had bought a radio, which was a brand named Braun, B-R-A-U-N, and that they had confiscated the radio.
Just a small clue of what was to come. Still, as a prominent pediatrician in Breslau, her father just couldn't believe things were as bad as they were.
He never wanted to emigrate. He didn't want to start over in a new country. He was really a very proud German up until that time. He had been a medical officer in the First World War at the front, and he said, I know these people, I know them under pressure, and they're very decent, and this kind of thing just can't last very long. First it couldn't come about, and then it definitely can't last very long.
But Gabrielle's mother, Ellinor Freund, née Bach, was convinced otherwise, especially after a night of violence against Germany's Jewish community on November 9, 1938, now infamously known as Kristallnacht.
Synagogues were burnt, and Jewish stores were destroyed, and there was a lot of breaking of glass. That's why it was called Kristallnacht. And people were arrested, and it was horrible. And so this then was supposed to be repaired out of the money that was confiscated from people like my parents.
In fact, the morning after Kristallnacht, 2 German officials paid Gabrielle's parents a visit.
And one of them sat down at my father's desk and inspected his income tax returns, and based on that decided how much of his money he was going to be allowed to keep, and the rest was going to be put on a blocked account. And the other guy walked around with my mother and took everything, jewelry and anything made of gold or silver, and had this suitcase and gave her a receipt for everything that he took. It was very official. That's how it was.
But I imagine you never saw those things again.
No, never saw these things again.
It was a terrible injustice that deeply affected her mother, Ellinor. How much so became evident during one of their last family vacations together.
We were going to meet at the Lake of Constance, and my mother wouldn't eat anything because she was sure it was poisoned. And she was, ever since, after the Kristallnacht business, she was always assuming somebody was following her. Much of that was pretty reasonable. I mean, she had been trying to convince my father for years to leave the country. So one night I heard them argue, which was a shock to me because my parents had managed to never argue in front of us. And my mother was becoming more and more hysterical, and my father sounded cool and rational. And, in retrospect, all along she was right and he was wrong.
Shortly thereafter, in October 1940, Walther, Ellinor, and Ellinor's mother, Rosa Bach, née Pearl, seen here with young Gabrielle, were sent to a French concentration camp, Camp de Gurs. In 2004, when Gabrielle visited the woods where the camp once stood with sons Stephen and Don, all that was left were a few signs and markers. But the mental image of what the camp used to be remains strong to this day, as Gabrielle describes a postcard she received from her father during his internment.
That they had been on the train for 5 days, and that they were now in this camp. So my mother and grandmother were in one îlot, and my father was in an adjacent îlot, and that the barracks were about 100 people to each barrack, and that it was fairly muddy and not very much food. So that is where they survived the winter. It was very little food, and it was a lot of exposure. It's in the mountains, so it was cold.
Eventually, most of the Jews sent to this camp were transferred to Auschwitz and executed, but Gabrielle's parents and grandmother survived. How they avoided the gas chamber and the emotional reunions that followed will be the subjects of the next episode of New Mexicast. I'm Rosalinda Roman. My apologies for stringing you along for 2 whole episodes about the role that Swiss chocolate plays in a family member's survival, but I promise it will be included in next episode, which will be the conclusion of this 4-part series. By the way, I know there are many of you who are new viewers here on New Mexicast, thanks to Facebook, iTunes, and just general word of mouth. I wanted to mention that this is a little bit of a deviation from what I normally do here on New Mexicast. Now, mind you, that is not an apology. This story about Gabrielle and her family, I feel, is very important to do. I am very glad I am working on this story. But we're going to have one more episode of this series, and then we'll go back to some of the lighter fare that New Mexicast is kind of known for, because I do have 2 little girls, and mostly I try to do stories that I can do with them by my side. All right, well, thanks to all of you who are watching and spreading the word. It means the world to me. I'm Rosalinda Roman, and I will see you in 2 weeks. And of course, here on New Mexicast, the TV show, you don't have to wait 2 weeks for the conclusion of this 4-part series. Just stick around until after the break for part 4 of the Gabrielle Falk story and a personal tribute from my own family.